Toronto Maple Leafs have made multiple moves ahead of tonight's big game against the Flyers, and Craig Berube continues to change up the lineup. We're going to break that down as well as discuss multiple new updates surrounding the Leafs. So stay tuned for all that in this episode. But before we get into it, if you're a part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, 71% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. Your guys' support has been unbelievable. And quick note, Darius will be live following tonight's game, so make sure to stay tuned for the live stream. What's going to be, so far, like every game is, the biggest game of the season as the Leafs are attempting to catch up to the Panthers for first place in the Atlantic Division. That is the biggest goal right now. It's going to be the goal until the end of the season. And Craig Berube, he was fired up at practice yesterday, and now he's making some more moves to the lineup. And let's start with the goaltending tonight, because this is, again, actually a pretty big question mark going forward for this team, especially as the playoffs inch closer and closer. But it has been confirmed that Anthony Stolarz is going to be starting in net tonight for the Leafs at home. His last start was, of course, Thursday, so a few days away. He played pretty well in that start. Obviously, Craig Berube ran with Joseph Woll in the last game. Darius, I want to get your thoughts on this, as well as we'll break down the lines in a minute here. But Stolarz gets the nod tonight, and it's been a big question mark going forward about who the goalie is going to be as you approach the playoffs.
I think this was expected that Stolarz was going to go tonight. The only thing that, the last week has shown us was the matchups. What games was Joseph Woll getting? And I feel like he was getting games against tougher opponents, right? Maybe not Nashville if you look at it that way, but certainly against obviously the Avalanche. And then obviously the next night you're playing a team that's outside of the playoffs and the Rangers. So they gave Stolarz that game. I thought he looked okay. Like he didn't look bad in that game by any means, but the hot hand right now I think is Joseph Woll, and I don't think a lot of the goals were necessarily his fault on Saturday. So I'm interested to see how not only the team bounces back, but how Stolarz plays tonight if he settles in, because he did have a good game I thought against the Rangers. Yes, they let in 3 goals, but again I don't know if they were necessarily his fault. So I want to see how he settles in today. And the Flyers are not a great team, so this should be another game where you come in and you should win. And if they don't, then we'll see what Berube has in store, because again, he was not messing around yesterday. So I'm curious to see how they bounce back in this one.
Yeah, this is a must win. Let's dive into some of the changes, and this is actually pretty notable here. Pontus Holmberg is staying out late at the Leafs optional skate. He projects to be a healthy scratch tonight with David Kampf returning to the lineup. And we were wondering what Craig Berube was going to do ahead of tonight's game, what changes they were going to make. And we knew in yesterday's video, Pontus Holmberg was on the projected lines, but that has changed now as Pontus Holmberg is out, which is something that I am a bit of a fan of here. And let's dive into the projected lines for tonight's game. And again, Pontus is out. You have Nyes, Matthews, Marner, McMahon, Tavares, Nylander, and then of course Lawton now getting moved up to the third line, which is very notable, alongside Domi and Robertson, obviously playing the wing, which is interesting with Domi playing the center, but something that he was more comfortable with in the games with the Leafs when he's played wing. He's looked more comfortable, and of course with the Flyers, he's played the majority of his games prior to getting traded at the wing spot after John Tortorella moved him there from the center position. And then in the fourth line, you have Lorenz, Kampf, Yarncroke. So they're sticking with Calle Yarncroke, and they're putting David Kampf back in, which means Pontus Holmberg, you mentioned it in yesterday's video, has went from the second line to the third line, in theory to the fourth line, but just taken out of the fourth line, and now is a healthy scratch tonight, because obviously I think it makes sense here. If you're going to run Domi at third line center, you're probably best off running Kampf as opposed to Pontus Holmberg as a fourth line center. You know what you're going to get from David Kampf. He's good in the PK, and he hasn't been great so far, but this lineup right here looks pretty similar to what a playoff lineup I think would look like. And I think their ultimate goal is to have Scott Laughton in the third line, either as a wing or a center, probably whatever one he ends up producing the most with.
So this is very interesting to me, because I think that Holmberg is actually a very smart hockey player, but I don't think he's brought anything to the table this season very specific, right? Like, I don't know if he's played a role for the team. He's just been kind of out there at all times, and he's shifted around the lineup. And, like we talked about yesterday, he's gone in the span of a week from the second line to the third line, in theory, like you said, the fourth line yesterday in practice, and now he's out of the lineup. He's a healthy scratch, right? And I think obviously they want to play around with Laughton on the third line and see how that kind of works out. I wonder if they swap a little bit here, where Laughton takes some time at center. I don't know if that's too likely, but I just wonder if they're going to try some stuff, because they have been the last couple of games. So again, with Holmberg, he's just been an interesting player this year. Again, I think that he's a smart hockey player. Even Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews at one point were playing with him and said the same thing, that he's so smart, he knows where to go and all these things. But at the same time, he's taken some weird routes to pucks this year, and he's not, the most physical player on the puck, right? Even though we have seen him do that in the past, he hasn't brought it this year. So he's been an interesting case this year. And again, he's out of the lineup at this point. And I think if the playoffs were were to start tomorrow, I want David Kampf as my fourth line center. I feel like he brings a lot in terms of penalty killing, and he's been there, that experience, stuff like that. I know Holmberg has played in the playoffs before, but I just
Agreed.
don't see a spot for him in the lineup right now. And not only that, where does Pacioretty factor into all of this as well, right? I just don't know if Holmberg's going to be on the playoff lineup because he hasn't done anything in particular to put himself in that position. Whereas other guys like Lawton, you just traded for him. I want to see him tonight, what he can bring, but we know what Pacioretty can bring in terms of playoffs and the physicality and everything like that. Holmberg hasn't done one thing specific this year where you're like, he has to be in the lineup for that reason. So I feel like he's going to be probably the odd man looking into the playoffs here.
Now, obviously, the one player who's continued to get reps is Nick Robertson. He's been playing okay. If Patches comes back here, he's either going to replace what you'd assume would be Jurgen Kirk or Nick Robertson, and that'll be an interesting conversation point as we approach the playoffs, which we're approaching them right now. Looking at Pontus Holmberg's stats this season, he's having a pretty bad year. 15 points in 58 games. Again, Pontus is not really going to be known for scoring a bunch of goals or putting up a ton of points, but his role, like you mentioned, the reason that he's moving so much is because he hasn't had a defined role on any of the lines. And clearly, Bobby McMann is the better player on the second line. I remember, I think it was either this Saturday or last Saturday on the panel, I think it was this Saturday, kept talking about how Bobby McMann should be on the second line the whole time. Don't know why he hasn't been there the whole year. Is Bobby McMann on his own a second line player? That's up for debate, but he fits perfectly alongside John Tavares and William Nylander, which allows him to hopefully continue to get back. As we've seen, especially when he got moved down to that third line, Bobby McMann was really hot on the second line and then got pretty cold on the third line. So stick him at the second line. And yeah, Scott Laughton is going to be good. And speaking of Scott Laughton, let's not forget he's playing his former team, the Flyers, for the first time. He said it's going to be different. Looking at the pre-scout, and I was in some of the clips. So this would be a great game for Scott Laughton to have his first goal, or even points aside, his first real breakout game. I think it started with his game against the Predators, again, overlooked by the brutal play by the Leafs. But this is going to be Scott Laughton's game here, I think, to really shine. And maybe that's why they moved him up to the third line against his former team.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see that, how he plays and factors into this game because he has some insight into the Flyers, right? And obviously he was joking this morning too. There were some reports that, he's staying in the same hotel as the Flyers right now, and he has a room close to John Tortorella and that whole thing. That was pretty funny. But I wonder if, there's something tonight where maybe he drops the gloves or something just to get the team fired up where he's like, you know what, I'm part of this team now. He's already done that for this team, but against his former team, like I think it'd be pretty interesting to see if he does anything like that. So he's got to make a difference, I think, down the stretch here. He's got to do something that, like we just talked about with Holmberg, he's got to make some type of difference, some reason to have him in the lineup, and he hasn't necessarily done that yet. And I feel like nerves have gotten the best of him. We've seen it early on, right? We talked about it in videos last week that, maybe he was doing too much, and I think that he's settled in a little bit now. Nashville, that game was probably his best game, not a good game for the team, but maybe he's settling back in now. But I am interested to see, what he's going to do tonight and if he does something pretty crazy.
Yeah, a couple other things here. Craig Berube, you can see this in the following practice in the media. A media member asked Berube, John Tavares' strong comment after the Nashville loss and if the Leafs should be PO'd, and you can see that he said you're allowed to use that word. So some interesting things. And to be fair, Craig Berube was, we'll say, PO'd as well in yesterday's game, or yesterday's practice, following what was a horrific loss. And again, I'm going to call it horrific. It was a bad loss against the Predators. Again, like you mentioned, a couple other things. Lawton is staying at the same hotel because that he probably still hasn't gotten a home or anything like that left or yet. Couple other things here. Scott Laughton on this morning on joining the Maple Leafs ahead of tonight's game and against his former team, of course, an unbelievable team that has really good talent. To have a chance to win a Stanley Cup at this point in my career is really special to me. So this is the breakout game for Scott Laughton. I'm calling it here first. Also, shout out to Ben Danford on winning the Bobby Orr Defenseman of the Year award. He's going to be a big factor going forward, and it's one of the reasons that the Leafs weren't willing to include him in any of the trades because they definitely need more defensemen. Let us know down below what your thoughts are. We'll be live following tonight's game. It is a must-win for Leafs, so hopefully they take care of business.